Our first talk is by Amaya Atucha. She is the Wisconsin fruit extension specialist, and she's going to be talking about the 15-year mulch study.
Thank you, Sarah. I told her I really don't need an introduction. I'm playing local this time. The ones that don't know, I'm the new fruit crop specialist. I started a little bit more than a year ago. And today I have a talk on some of my studies that I did as a grad student when I was at Cornell. And the title of the talk, the real title of the talk, is Orchard Floor Management Systems. But Anna just put a little bit of her in the program and she changed it. But we're going to be talking about floor management systems today. So I think they are recording us, so I'm going to have to stay here. And there we go. So just first, an acknowledgement. All of the studies that I'll be showing today, I said I was part of my graduate studies, and so a big thank you to the Department of Horticulture at Cornell that supported me as a grad student, my advisor, Dr. Ian Merwin, and technical support from Mike Brown. Without them, I would have not been able to do any of this work. So just an introduction of why we are looking and why floor management and soil health, which is that concept that we hear a lot, is important. First of all, we know that it helps maintaining just the soil fertility, the soil tilth. It has an impact, the way that we manage our soil in our orchards has an impact on weed pressure and competition for water and nutrients. We all know with these new high density systems how we talk about how it's very important to control the weeds, because we want these tiny little trees to grow fast and to fill up the space. Well, one of the reasons is because of soil, nutrient, and water competition. When we have a ground cover or when we have a mulch also, we know that that is going to have an effect on the soil temperatures and moisture extremes. So days that are very hot, that soil probably is not going to get that hot, and the root system is not going to suffer that much when we have a cover on our soil than when we have our soil completely exposed. Also, when we have specific ground covers, we can provide a habitat for some beneficial insects and pollinators. And very important in certain orchards with slope is to minimize soil erosion. So what I'm going to first present is a study, it's a long-term study on the effect of 4 ground cover management systems that I did on an apple orchard. And so just the basic setting. What we did is over 17 years, we had 4 different ground management systems that I'll explain afterwards. And we look at how the trees were growing, the nutrition of the tree, production, and we look at what was happening with the soil physical and biological properties. So here are the 4 treatments that we had. We had a pre-emergence herbicide in which the soil was completely bare. We had no weeds. We had nothing was growing underneath the trees. We had a post-emergence that you can see some weeds going on here. We had a mix of post-emergent herbicides. It was mainly glyphosate. We would apply it twice during the growing season, early in May, and then we would apply it again around July, August. And so some weeds would grow, but during the times that we would apply the herbicide, the weeds would die. Then we had a sod treatment that it was just basically the continuation of the sod that we had on the alleyways. We just planted the same sod underneath the trees. And then we had a mulch treatment that was right underneath the trees in the same, all of this in the same area, and that we will renew every other year. And so a little bit more specifics about the treatments. The variety that we had, this was a Empire on an M9 M11 planted in 1992. It was 3 by 6 meters. That was the planting frame. And we had, as I said, the 4 treatments, the pre-herb, the mix of pre-emergence herbicides, the post-herb, which was basically glyphosate, as I say, in May and July, the mow sod, which was a mix of just orchard grass, and then we had the mulch, which was a hardwood bark mulch composed of all these different species. And as I said, the orchard and the treatment were were established in 1992 and were maintained since then. So what did we see during the time that we measure and we look at these different treatments? So when we look at tree growth, you can see here the cumulative tree cross-sectional area in centimeters. So it's basically the area of the main trunk. So from 1992 all the way to 2008, we measured this, and every time you see this asterisk here, it means that there's a statistical difference. So you can see in the very first year, the blue and the red, so the first two columns are going to be the herbicide treatments. Then the green one is the grass, and then the black one is the mulch. So what we saw is that during the first year, we saw some significant difference with, no surprise, the herbicide treatments. Those trees were bigger. So the first maybe 4 years, we saw that there was a significant difference in favor of using the herbicides. Trees were bigger. But as we move on, and that's where this study is so interested, we start seeing that there's a shift on tree growth, and we started seeing that the mulch, actually, the trees on the mulch are much bigger and statistically different from all the other treatments. And what we get by the last year, we can see how the mulch trees are significantly bigger than all of the rest. And we can see actually that is the tree in the pre-herb or the pre-emergence herbicides, the treatment that was bare soil. Those trees are significantly smaller than the rest, especially than the mulch, which was very different from the trend that we saw the first 4 or 5 years. So this is very interesting because most of the studies that we do in orchard systems, we usually do 4 or 5 years, and we're like, wow, that's a lot of years. Well, this shows that there's significant changes in trends when you keep measuring things like different treatments of ground covers or different soil management systems. So when we look at, we excavated one tree, and we decided to divide it and look at what was the weight of the main trunk, of the main roots, of the secondary roots, and of the fine roots. But we also look at if there was any difference in the trees itself in terms of the size of the trunks, the main scaffolds, the 3+ year branches, the 2-year branches, and the 1-year branches. So when we look at this, we actually didn't see a lot of significant difference. This was 10 years after the treatments were established. What we mainly saw was a difference on the secondary roots. We saw that it was actually in the treatment that has the glyphosate applied twice during the growing season. We saw in that one and in the mulch a little bit more roots than on the sod and on the bare soil treatment. And this is probably due to competition also. It might be possible in the sod that there were less secondary roots because of competition with the sod itself. But in the case of the pre-emergence herbicide, what we started seeing at this time, and if you remember the previous graph, the trees started declining in terms of growth. And so what probably we're seeing here is that the soil properties are starting to deteriorate, and that is affecting the development of the roots. When we look at yield, here we have the kilograms per tree, and starting from 1994 all the way to 2008. Again, we see that in the very first years is actually the 2 herbicides, so the first 2 columns that had the highest yield, which, it makes sense. We have bigger trees. They had bigger trees at higher yields at the very beginning. But then once again, we started seeing that there's a lot of shift. There's some years that we had spring frost, so that's why you see this very low yield here. But we see that overall, after 17 years, there's not really a clear significant difference. You can see some trends. You can see that the mulch still produces consistently higher than the bare soil treatment. And it's actually the post-herb, so the glyphosate applied twice a week, letting some of the weeds grow, that is very comparable to the mulch. So once again, this illustrates that what happens at the very beginning might not be what we see in a mature orchard afterwards. So what happens with soil fertility? I know there's a lot of data here, but I just want to point out some very specific things. We measure here, we have 1992, 93, 95, 2000, 2005, 2006, and 2007. So by 2007, one of the biggest difference is that if we look at the phosphorus, it's significantly different. Mulch had 10 times more phosphorus in the soil. The same if you look at calcium, how much higher and significantly higher mulch is after those 17 years. And then the pH, we see some difference also in the pH. We tend to have a little bit higher pH on the mulch, which was significantly different. And we see some difference, significantly difference on the magnesium. So what happens is that over time, that mulch that we kept putting on and putting on and putting on started decomposing and releasing a lot of these nutrients that just the bark of those trees had. And thus, those were probably not available at the very beginning when we saw almost no significant difference. But after 17 years of putting more and more and more mulch, what we saw is every time we would excavate the soil is this big layer of like dark organic matter, decomposed organic matter, full of roots. All the roots were there. Well, no wonder, with all of those nutrients there and being moist and cool, of course the roots want to grow there. When we looked at the carbon in the soil and the nitrogen and carbon to nitrogen ratio, which is a good indication of microbial activity, we saw that the percent of nitrogen in the soil was significantly higher once again in the mulch with no difference on the other three treatments. When we look at the carbon, again, it's the mulch after those 17 years that has, even before that, by 99, so 7 years after the treatments were established, already the mulch treatment was significantly higher carbon content. And the carbon to nitrogen content, again, was significantly higher for the mulch, and there were no significant difference between the other treatments. Some soil physical properties, some of the things that were measured by Oliveira in the same study, by 8 years after the treatments were established, is that you can see that the mulch treatment has a significantly lower bulk density, so that soil was looser and more fluffy and nicer soil. We also see there's difference in the infiltration rate of the water and the soil capacity. So that soil had a significantly higher water holding capacity. It had the capacity of keep more moist in that soil than the other treatments, especially that the pre-emergence treatment, the treatment that had bare soil, which we saw a little bit of compactation on the very top, so a lower infiltration rate. This graph here shows soil biological properties, so it's showing microbial activity in the soil, which is very important for mineralization, as you know. And so on the very top, it shows soil respiration. It's a good indication of how much activity that soil has, how much microbial activity is happening. And so you can see, this is a work done by Yao in 2005 in the same orchard. You can see that the mulch here, the first line with the X's, is significantly higher in terms of soil respiration than the other treatments. When we look at the number of bacteria, so on the colonies, the number of colonies of bacteria forming the soil, we see that the mulch also has significant, and the pre-herb, the bare soil, very, very low bacteria activity. And this counts for pathogenics and beneficials. And for fungi, once again, surprisingly, it's actually the grass that has a very significant higher content of colonies of fungi in the soil compared with other treatments that were not significantly different. So bottom line, we can see that the pre-emergent herbicide had a very, very low microbial activity on those soils. So just a couple of summaries of these studies. First, the total soil nitrogen carbon content and the ratio of carbon to nitrogen are essential for plant nutrients and were much higher in the mulch treatment after 16 years than on the pre-emergence treatment, so the bare soil treatment. We saw that in the weed-free plots, so in the pre-emergence herbicides, most of the soil physical properties and biological activity was deteriorated We saw that soil was much more compacted, it held less water, it also had less roots, and there was less microbial activity. And it was actually the post-emergent herbicide, so that glyphosate applies twice during the growing season, letting the weeds grow during the rest of the growing season, which produced the best results in terms of compromising of soil fertility, soil microbial activity, but also in terms of fruit production. That is what we are very much interested in. This is very nice, but if we don't produce any fruit, it doesn't work. So the second study that I'm going to present today is a study in which we look at the entire system. We wanted to know, given that we have all of these treatments, what happened with the nitrogen budget? What happens with the nitrogen in the system once you have a ground cover management system established for so long? So the objectives were mainly we were concerned about pesticides and fertilizer excessive use and leaching into the groundwater, which was a problem that we had in upstate New York. So the idea started from there. We wanted to try to look, well, if we treat the soil differently, we manage our weeds differently, can we affect the overall nitrogen budget of the soil, of the plant, given that we have all of this previous information? So we quantified the inputs and the outputs of nitrogen in the orchard with these 4 different treatments, which are going to be the same treatment, in 1 year in which we applied fertilizer, and in a year in which we did not apply any fertilizer. So in the year that a fertilizer was applied, 53 pounds of nitrogen per acre were applied. So again, the same treatments, 2 years, a year with fertilizer and a year without fertilizer. So what did we see, or how did we measure it? This is our little budget. So we look at everything that was adding nitrogen to the system. The fertilization, all the nitrogen that was coming from the irrigation and precipitation water, and the nitrogen that was being mineralized from the bark mulch, from the treatment that had the mulch. We look at everything that had internal fluxes, so all of the nitrogen that was being used and coming back to the system just in the surface, all those weeds, all the grass, we would basically clip that grass and the grass would stay there, decompose, and the nitrogen would just go from the grass to the soil, from the grass to the soil, and it would stay there. We measure that. We measure how much nitrogen was being recycled through the leaf litter, through the prune wood, and we calculated how much how much nitrogen was coming out of the soil. Then we look at the outputs, how much nitrogen we were taking out of the system through the fruit, and all the nitrogen that was going out through the water that was leaching all the way out of the orchard, and the surface runoff water that had also nitrogen. So just to show you more or less how we did these things. So this is how we measure all the nitrogen that was coming out from surface vegetation. We had these litter bag studies in which we would clip some of the vegetation on top, put it on these special bags, and measure over time from day 0 how much nitrogen they had until several days afterwards to see how much of that nitrogen had been decomposed by the microbes in the soil and going back to the soil. So that's how we measure that. Whoop. 1 second. I think that. This is how we measure the amount of nitrogen in the leaves. So what we did is we chose one tree, we put a big net, we cut all of the leaves from those trees, we dried them, we measured them, and we took a sample and we analyzed how much nitrogen it had. So that's how we measure how much nitrogen there's in the leaves, which was a lot of work. And then we measure the outputs. The fruit, very easy. Of course, we measure every single fruit that we had. We took a sample and we analyzed how much nitrogen was there so that we can take it out of the budget. The subsurface leaching, what we did is we had this system in which each one of the plots, these are each one of the plots, we had 12 plots, was hydrologically isolated, and we had some pipes, some drainage pipe that would capture all of the water. It was probably 3 to 4 feet under the ground, and it would take us to these stations in which we could collect water there. And we had a little system of some tippet buckets that were connected to a data logger. So all of the water that was infiltrating the soil was being collected on these pipes and being driven to these tippet buckets that you can see here, that when they're full, they switch, they flip like this, and so you know the exact volume of water that you have in there. And so if you have the number of tips, you know how much water ran over when there was a storm or when we irrigated. We could calculate that, and we would take periodically samples of that water and analyze how much nitrogen it had. And so then we calculated all of the nitrogen that was lost through the leachate, so the water that was infiltrating the orchard. In a very similar way, we measured the water that was exiting the orchards through surface runoff. We had a system in which we had half a pipe on the bottom of these plots, and it would collect all of the water running from the surface, and it would once again go to a tipping bucket, and then we would do the same as we did with the leachate. So what did we see? You can see on the graph on your left side is an F for the year that we fertilizer with nitrogen, and NF for no fertilizer. So here what we have is the amount of nitrogen that was being mineralized from what was growing just on the surface of the soil. So here are the grams of nitrogens per kilogram of biomass. So this is those little packs that we had, that we put, these liter bags that we put. And we can see that in the year that we apply fertilizer, these solid squares here show the mulch. It shows how the mulch mineralized much more nitrogen. So that vegetation, those weeds that were growing in the mulch, had a lot of nitrogen. And if you cut them down and you let them mineralize, they were going to put a lot of nitrogen in the system. The year that we had no fertilizer, we still saw that the mulch was the one that was releasing the most nitrogen from that surface vegetation, just because the mulch was also giving nitrogen to the system. So if you had the weeds growing where there was a lot of nitrogen, well, those weeds contained a lot of nitrogen as well. When we look at the average concentration of nitrogen that was coming out of the runoff water, you can see that in the year with fertilizer, here are the treatments, the treatment with bare soil had the highest concentration of nitrogen exiting the system through runoff. While the year that, when we look at the leachate, we actually saw that it was the mulch in both the year that has significantly higher nitrogen exiting the system. So what this means is basically there was more nitrogen coming out through runoff on the bare soil, because the bare soil, as I was showing before, had lower infiltration of water. The water was just running off in terms of coming in because there was this crust that formed because we had had it exposed for so long. It had nothing to protect it. While the mulch, there was a lot of water actually infiltrating the mulch because it had a much higher porosity. The water would go into the soil, and it would drive all of this nitrogen coming out of the mulch after 17 years, and that's why we saw these really high concentrations. And so when we look at the water flow, once again, we see that the mulch had the lowest amount of surface runoff because all the water was infiltrated, but it had the highest level of leaching water because more water was coming in and going through the soil profile and then exiting to the groundwater. So again, this is a lot of data, but what I really want to show is up here, there are all the treatments, the bare soil, the glyphosate, the sod, and the mulch. And here's the budget. You can see this is everything that was exiting, all the nitrogen that was exiting the system out of the orchard, all of the internal fluxes, and all of the outputs. So you can see here the mulch, it has a significantly higher input. There was a lot of nitrogen going into the system when we had a mulch, either basically from the decomposition of the mulch. When we looked at the balance, which is basically if you add what you take out with, what you put in with what was being recycling, and you subtract what you're taking out, overall, what we saw is that the year that we had fertilizer, so it's the first column for each one of these, the 20, 10, 43, and 187, they were all positive, which basically means that orchard had more than enough nitrogen. The nitrogen that we were putting in with the nitrogen that we were taking out, it was a positive result. There was extra nitrogen that what the orchard really needed. But the year in which we apply no fertilizer, you can see that both of the herbicide treatments have negative number. It means that there was more nitrogen being lost in that orchard. So there was not enough nitrogen. But with the ground cover and with the mulch, the year without fertilizer is still positive, which means that those systems, after 17 years, in a way, they had equilibrated and they were given enough nitrogen for those trees to grow, to produce, and there was less nitrogen being lost out of the system. And this happened after 17 years of those treatments. Okay, I only have 3 more minutes, so we're gonna go fast through the summary. The soil nitrogen that was mineralizing and recycling, so basically everything that was coming from the leaves, from the pruning, from the surface vegetation, all of that accounted for over 60% of the nitrogen that was being recycling. The harvested fruit represented more than 70% of the nitrogen that was coming out of the orchard. So if the nitrogen was coming out through runoff and through leachate and through the fruit that we were harvesting, 70% of that nitrogen was coming out with the fruit. Most of the nitrogen losses occur through leachate rather than runoff. So this was a big eye-opening for us because it meant that there's a serious potential contamination of groundwater because a lot of that nitrogen was just being leached out of the system. As I said, there were positive balance overall for the sod and the mulch, but it was not the case for the herbicides. And potential long-term problems with the nitrogen leachate in the orchards that made us think that maybe if you are applying organic amendments like compost, or you're using mulch, or you're using any other source of organic nutrients, that you should be cautious about how much you put in and how often you're putting it, because you might end up what would happen with us with the mulch, that mulch was being mineralized and there was so much nitrogen coming out of that there was a lot of nitrogen going into the groundwater, which is a big problem. And overall, after 17 years, the system was not balanced for the 2 herbicides, and we saw that the main reason was that the recycling of the nitrogen was much lower when we were having an herbicide compared when we had the grass or when we had the mulch. So with that, I think that I'm running out of time. I'll be happy to take any questions. No, it was clay. It was mainly clay.